Welcome to this 8th lesson in our Citizens Constitutional Advocacy Council CCAC 1.0 training series. This is CCAC Lesson 1.8 in our series. At the end of our last lesson, James Madison cautioned us of the most dangerous threat to our participatory constitutional republic's survival: special interest groups taking over government. The term Madison used was factions. They and special interest groups are the same thing. In Federalist 10, a faction is a number of citizens, whether amounting to a majority or a minority of the whole, who are united or actuated, in other words, activists, by some common impulse of passion or of interest, adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. Special interest groups, lobbyists, corporate interests, use bribes and threats to force our elected and appointed officials to do their bidding. Madison warned us that these groups harm the Republic and eventually bring us down. He was right. However, how did we get so dangerously at risk today? It started with a change the people organized politically took over 100 years ago. The polity was undermined. It isn't time at the moment to go into detail about this change. What is important now is that we understand what polity is and that it affects us seriously in our ability to remain safe and secure as Americans, both politically and economically. For example, a 2014 study by two prominent American universities, Northwestern and Princeton, carried out over a span of more than 20 years, has concluded that the United States is no longer a participatory constitutional republic, but rather an oligarchy. This study validates what many of us as Americans already know too well to be so. An oligarchy is a form of government in which a tiny number of people control government public policy. We have an interview with the author of this research study. According to this author, quote, "Contrary to what decades of political science research might lead you to believe, ordinary citizens have virtually no influence over what their government does in the United States, and economic elites and special interest groups, or Madison's word, factions, especially those representing business, have a substantial degree of influence. Government policymaking over the last few decades reflect the preferences of those groups, of economic elites, and of organized interests," unquote. Madison warned us to keep factions from our government, yet this is exactly where we are. Factions are controlling the United States government at the local, state, and general government in Washington, D.C. And please note, the founders used the term general government. The general government is the presidency, Congress, and the court system predominantly, but not all in Washington, D.C. The federal government is the government spread across the United States up to the general government in Washington, bottom to top, and everything in between. We need to use the right words. Now back to that researcher who says that this oligarchy is not just, quote, a very small number of wealthy people who are pulling strings behind the scenes to determine what government does. It's more complicated than that. It's not only Sheldon Adelson or the Koch brothers or Bill Gates or George Soros who are shaping governmental public policy making. What economic elite domination and biased pluralism mean is that rather than average citizens of moderate means having an important role in determining policy, ability to shape outcomes is restricted to people at the top of the income distribution and to organized groups that represent primarily, although not exclusively, business, unquote. And this is vitally important. One of the most pernicious groups controlling our society, public policy, and undermining national security is not even a business interest, although certainly contains that component, but without saying it to protect himself from harm by stating the entire truth, the author may be giving a clue of who else is involved when he says, organized groups that represent primarily, although not exclusively, businesses. The study covered 21 years from 1981 to 2002. The researchers asked over 2,000 survey questions by income level, middle income or top income, if people would favor or oppose certain changes in federal government policy. The researchers then tracked the policy changes to see if they were adopted or not and which groups' preferences became the policy. Researchers also believe that, quote, common citizens overall can have fairly sensible policy preferences which appear not to change much if citizens have an opportunity to learn more and the opportunity to debate the policy and view pros and cons, end quote. The way Caucus says it is, we are smart enough, strong enough, and competent enough to govern ourselves if we have proper subsidiarity to practice popular self-government. The author says that when our public servants are listening to their constituents who elected them and responding to their wishes, research concludes that, quote, we just look at whether they're responded to by government policymakers, and we find that in the case of ordinary Americans, they're not, unquote. Government policymakers do not make policy by listening to those who elect them. They look to the special interest groups in big business, high finance, public policy groups, and NGOs, not the American people. This is corporate fascism, just like what was going on in 1775, just prior to the American Revolution under mercantilism. The more things change, the more they remain the same. The question is, what changed to where we now as Americans have no political influence as a recognized part of the constitutional government? The answer? Quote, part of it is clearly that while politicians need votes while in office, they need money to obtain and retain office. So they need to balance the activities that will benefit them in terms of money with the activities that will benefit in terms of votes. Voters are not particularly effective at holding politicians accountable for their policies they adopt, unquote. This is where caucus will be very important. Quoting again, voters also have a limited choice set when going to an election. We find that policies adopted during presidential election years in particular are more consistent with public preferences than policies adopted in other years of the electoral cycle, unquote. Interestingly, what this advises is that since we currently do not have a policy that gives us equal influence during off-presidential election years, the policymakers do not feel the pressure to govern by the consent of the governed. We need a polity change to enforce our will on our public servants. Two more critical ideas. One central factor, quote, is the role of money in our political system and the overwhelming role that affluent individuals and organized interests play in campaign finance and in lobbying, unquote. And this is vitally important. Quote, the second thing is the lack of mass organizations that represent and facilitate the voice of ordinary citizens, unquote. In conclusion, caucus has the power to be of a polity correction of the problem of money and say by the good people. We knew this was true. This study confirms what we knew all along. If we do not govern ourselves, someone else is going to do it for us. Finally, this researcher tells us that, quote, the middle class has not done well over the past 3.5 decades and certainly has not done well during the Great Recession. The political system responded to the crisis in a way that led to a pretty nice recovery for economic elites and corporations, unquote. But as our declaration says, quote, we the people have been left to be more prone to suffer while evils are sufferable than to alter the forms to which we are accustomed, unquote. The bottom line, we need to seriously look at our polity and make real adjustments now once we understand how it was changed, when and by whom. That will be covered soon in a future lesson. This completes the 8th lesson, CCAC 1.8. Thank you for listening to this segment as part of our CCAC 1.0 series in our national orientation. Please join us for the next session in the series as we continue to unfold the Citizens Constitutional Advocacy Council story. This is the extraordinary process in which CCAC will successfully provide continuity of government of, by, and for the people. In our next lesson, CCAC 1.9, we will go on to explain further details of how we implement our Citizens Constitutional Advocacy Council. If you now understand the necessity of revitalizing constitutional polity at the state and local level, please join this cause by going to www.ccac-us.com and registering on our official website. Take Post-Quiz 1.0. Upon passing the quiz with a perfect score, you will be directed on how to take the next step in the process of becoming a member of this vital organization. Please don't shortchange this process. Listen to and study the CCAC 1.0 material carefully. If you have questions or concerns about what you're learning so far or issues affecting your community, please refer to the links connected to this lesson or contact the person who gave you this information. We extend our best wishes from the Citizens Constitutional Advocacy Council.